The crucial importance of strictly limiting the volume or duration of high-intensity muscular effort might be made more clear when looked at in terms of the body's capacity to cope with stress. While we are exposed to multitudinous forms of stress every day, there are three we can all identify with: the stress of sunlight on the skin, the stress of friction on the palms of the hands, and the stress of exercise on the muscles. Up to a very definite point, exposure to intense ultraviolet sunlight will lead to the formation of a tan. 1 minute more exposure than that required to stimulate the formation of a tan, however, results in a burn. Carried to radical extremes, overexposure to the sun's intense rays will cause stroke, poisoning, and even death. Having exceeded the threshold point, the body's recuperative subsystems are no longer able to successfully cope with the stress of the sun, and the skin breaks down and burns. The formation of a tan is the result of a compensatory process of the body designed to allow us to cope more successfully with the same stress in the future, which is to say, with less disturbance of the body's resources. The burn is an example of a reverse process of depletion. Instead of building up a protective barrier, tan, the body decompensated and lost tissue, burned. The buildup of a callus on the palm of the hand is the result of a similar process. The skin of the palms, which protects the hands from constant contact with abrasive objects, is generally much thicker than the skin on other parts of your body. But the repeated handling of extremely rough objects, like the knurled grip of a barbell, may be too abrasive for even the palms to endure without breaking down. If friction is abrasive enough, the formation of a callus will be stimulated. And if the amount of friction is not sufficient to wear away the growth of a callus as it is forming, a callus would indeed be produced. While the friction has to be intense enough to stimulate the formation of a callus, too much would cause the skin to wear away completely. Here again, as with the stress of sunlight, the stress of friction on the palms of the hands will result in a compensatory buildup of tissue, in this case a callus, that will help prevent the wearing away of the skin when exposed to a similar stress in the near future. Carried to extremes, however, the body won't be able to build up the callus rapidly enough to compensate for the demands placed on it, and a reverse process of depletion will occur, eventually tearing the skin away altogether. Exercise, too, is a form of stress. Intense exercise can result in the production of a compensatory buildup of muscle tissue, which enables the body to cope with the same stress again in the near future with less disturbance to the body's limited reserve of resources. When carried on beyond the least amount required to stimulate the adaptive response, the excess drains the reserve of resources needed for recovery, and thus prevents the buildup of added muscle tissue. The amount of stress that the body can successfully cope with is directly related to the intensity of the stress. While the stress must be intense enough to stimulate an adaptive compensatory buildup of muscle tissue, as no amount of stress below the required level will produce the desired effect, only a very small amount of high-intensity stress is required to stimulate the buildup of new tissue. And the greater the intensity, the less the body will tolerate before decompensating, i.e., lose strength and mass. Now that it is understood that intense exercise must not be carried on beyond the precise or least amount required to stimulate an adaptive response, how does one go about discovering one could start an experiment with an arbitrary number of sets, such as 20? But if 20 sets doesn't work, and by work I mean yield continuous strength increases, where do you go? Up to 21 sets or down to 19 sets? Such an approach, besides being time-consuming, may, for a variety of reasons, never provide the answer. The logical place to launch an investigation aimed at discovering the precise amount of exercise required is with the least amount possible, which is 1 set. Even if you were skeptical, that 1 set would be sufficient. Such skepticism being the result of thinking still distorted by the premise more is better. Starting with the least amount possible is only logical, because if 1 set doesn't work, you have only one direction to go, which is up, since you can't perform 0 sets. If 1 set doesn't work, then there is a reason, a justification for going to 2 sets. And I can state unequivocally that based on my own training experience and working with all of my personal training clients, 1 set per exercise, and at the most 3 sets per muscle,
is all that is required.